Welcome to Delphi After Dawn Crime Stories with Jason King. I am your host, Jason King. Tonight I will be taking you back to March of 1644 in England and telling you a true story in great detail about a man in his early 20s named Matthew Hopkins, who appointed himself as the Witchfinder General. Yes, you heard me correctly. This man appointed himself as a general, and he went out and snatched up people, accusing them of being witches. He would keep them awake and deprive them of sleep for 48 hours. Then he would put them through several rigged tests that he made up himself. One of the tests he would perform was called pricking. If you had a birthmark or a mole you were born with, he would take a knife and poke the mole or birthmark with his knife. And if it didn't bleed, that meant you were a witch. Then he would execute you. But get this, when he would perform the pricking tests, nobody would ever bleed because he used a retractable knife. This is just one of many rigged tests he would make people perform. Now, let me take you on a deep dive into the life and death of the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins. Now, let's jump into it. England was torn. A war raged. Brother fought brother. This was the English Civil War. King Charles clashed with Parliament. The land itself seemed to cry out. Fields lay fallow. Homes stood empty. Or worse, they were burned. People lived in constant dread. Order had vanished. Chaos ruled. The old ways were crumbling. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. Hope was a flickering candle flame. In these desperate times, old beliefs resurfaced. Dark whispers filled the air. Whispers of witchcraft. People looked for reasons. Reasons for their pain. Reasons for their loss. Many believed the devil walked among them. His servants, the witches, worked his evil. They brought misfortune. They caused sickness and death. This fear was ancient. Now, it burned brighter than ever before. It was a fire consuming hearts. The war made things worse, much worse. With no strong government, hysteria spread. Communities turned inward. They looked for enemies within. It was easy to blame someone. An old woman, a lonely soul, anyone different. Accusations became weapons. Fear became a currency. The devil needed to be fought. Witches needed to be found. This cry echoed through shattered villages. The hunt was beginning. A chill wind swept across the land. It was not just the wind of winter. It was the wind of terror. Shadows danced in every corner. Every unexplained event. Every sudden illness. Every strange sound. All pointed to one thing. Witchcraft. The air grew thick with suspicion. People watched their neighbors. They listened for damning words. The familiar world became a place of hidden dangers. A nightmare was unfolding. Fear was a constant companion. It sat at every table. It lurked in every darkened room. England in the mid-17th century was a place of deep anxieties. The Civil War amplified every terror. People felt adrift. lost in a storm of violence and change. Suspicion became second nature. Trust eroded like stone in acid rain. A glance could be misread. A kind word twisted. The world felt unsafe. Why did people believe so readily? Why did the idea of witches take such a firm hold? Religion played a powerful role. The Bible spoke of witches. Preachers thundered against the devil. Science offered few answers then. Sickness, storms, failing crops. These were not understood as natural events. They were seen as acts of malice. Dark magic was the explanation. It was a simple answer to complex fears, an easy target for rage. The laws themselves offered little protection. Old statutes against witchcraft existed. They were often vague. They could be easily manipulated. In the chaos of war, justice was swift and often brutal. There were few safeguards for the accused. A mere accusation could be a death sentence. Powerful men could use these laws. They could use them for their own ends, to settle scores, to gain influence. The system was ripe for abuse. Ordinary people were terribly vulnerable. Anyone could fall under suspicion. A woman living alone. A person with a birthmark. Someone who kept pets. These could be signs of a pact with the devil. A whispered rumor could destroy a life. A pointed finger could lead to the gallows. Or worse, to the fire. There was nowhere to hide. The shadow of the Witchfinder was long, and it was drawing nearer. In times of great upheaval, figures emerge. Men who seem to offer solutions. Men who promise to restore order. Sometimes they are saviors. More often, they are opportunists. They feed on fear. They thrive in chaos. The English Civil War created such a vacuum, a space for ambition and cruelty to grow. The people were desperate. They yearned for an end to their suffering. They were ready to believe, ready to follow. A new kind of hunter was stirring. He was not yet known by name, but his shadow was beginning to fall. He saw the fear in people's eyes. He heard the whispers of witchcraft. He understood the hunger for justice, or what passed for justice in those dark days. He sensed an opportunity, a chance to rise, a chance to wield power. He would offer himself as a purifier, a cleanser of the land. His methods would be terrible. East Anglia became his proving ground. This region suffered greatly during the war. Puritanism was strong here. Belief in the devil's work was fervent. It was a place of isolated villages, small communities, places where fear could easily take root and spread like wildfire. The soil was fertile for a witch hunt. The people were primed. They were waiting for someone to lead them, someone to identify the evil in their midst. The stage was now set. The atmosphere was thick with dread. The legal tools, however flawed, were in place. The population was terrified. They were looking for scapegoats. They were looking for a strong hand. A man was about to step out of the shadows. He would claim a divine mission. He would promise to rid England of its witches. But his arrival would not bring peace. It would unleash a new wave of terror. A reign of horror was about to begin. His name was Matthew Hopkins. Soon, that name would be spoken in hushed, fearful tones across Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, and beyond. He was a man of modest beginnings. Some said a failed lawyer, but he possessed a keen mind and a chilling understanding of human nature. He saw the chaos of the Civil War. He saw the rising tide of witch panic, and he saw his chance. He would make himself indispensable. He gave himself a grand title, Witchfinder General. It sounded official. It sounded important. But it was a title of his own making. He had no formal commission from Parliament, no true legal authority. Yet, he acted as if he did. He carried himself with an air of grim certainty. He claimed to be doing God's work. Many, in their fear and desperation, believed him. They were eager for someone to take charge. Hopkins was not a physically imposing man, but he had a commanding presence. His eyes were said to be sharp, unsettling. He could be persuasive. He knew how to play on people's fears, their superstitions, their grief. He presented himself as an expert, an authority on the ways of the devil. He had a system, a methodology. He promised results. He promised to root out the witches who plagued them. His mission, as he declared it, was clear: to cleanse the land, to purify it of Satan's servants. He would travel from town to town, village to village, wherever he was invited, or wherever he sensed an opportunity. He would bring his methods, his questions, his accusations. The terror he unleashed would be profound. For the women and sometimes men who fell under his gaze, his arrival meant only one thing: the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. The true horror was just starting. Before the name Hopkins struck terror, there was just a man, a young man. His early years are shrouded in mist. Few solid facts remain. He was born around 1620 in Great Wenham, Suffolk, or perhaps Little Wenham. Even his birthplace is uncertain. This obscurity fits him like a cloak he would later wear, a cloak of mystery and dread. His beginnings were unremarkable. No one then could predict the dark path he would choose, or the infamy that would cling to his name forever. His father was James Hopkins, a Puritan clergyman, a man of God, or so he believed. Young Matthew grew up steeped in Puritan beliefs. He heard sermons about sin, about the devil's constant war for souls. He learned of witches, of their evil compacts. This upbringing surely shaped him. It planted seeds of conviction, or perhaps seeds of opportunity. Did he truly believe? Or did he see religion as a tool, a way to power? We cannot truly know. The man remains enigma. What did he do before the witch hunts? Some say he was a lawyer in Ipswich, but a failed one. Others suggest he worked as a shipping clerk in Manningtree. His knowledge of legal forms later seemed scant. His understanding of true justice, even less. He was likely a man of some education, but little success. Perhaps he felt overlooked, unimportant. A simmering resentment might have grown within him, a desire to make his mark, a terrible mark upon the world. East Anglia was his home, a region of England deeply scarred by war and fervent in its Puritan faith. Fear of witchcraft was rampant here, The soil was fertile for suspicion, for accusations, for a man like Hopkins to emerge. He was a product of his time, a dark mirror reflecting the anxieties of a nation. He was waiting, watching, learning. Soon he would step from these shadows. He would find his dreadful purpose. The world was not yet ready for him. The year was 1644. The place was Manningtree, a small town in Essex. Here the horror truly began. Local gossip swirled, whispers of strange occurrences, of unexplained misfortunes. An old woman named Elizabeth Clark was the target. She was poor, one-legged, an easy scapegoat. People said she consorted with familiars, imps given to her by the devil. These were the first sparks, igniting a fire that would consume many. Hopkins was nearby. He heard the talk. Matthew Hopkins lived in Manningtree at this time. He claimed to have overheard women discussing their compacts with the devil, or so he later said. He presented himself as a concerned citizen, a righteous man disturbed by evil. Elizabeth Clark became his first focus. He began to watch her, to gather evidence. He involved himself. Perhaps he saw the fear in the villagers' eyes. Perhaps he sensed the power that could be his. This was his moment, his dark calling. He did not act alone even then. John Stern, another local man, joined him. Stern shared Hopkins' zeal, or perhaps his opportunism. Together, they pushed the accusations. They interrogated Elizabeth Clark. They used methods that would become their trademark. Sleep deprivation, intimidation. They sought a confession. They sought names, more names. The web of suspicion began to grow. From one old woman, the accusation spread. The terror was taking root. This was no official investigation. Not at first. Hopkins had no authority, no legal standing. He was simply a local man. But he was persuasive. He was relentless, and the local magistrates were willing to listen. The fear of witchcraft was strong. They wanted solutions. Hopkins offered them. He positioned himself as an expert. The Manningtree case was his crucible. It transformed him from an obscure young man to a hunter of witches. His career had begun. Matthew Hopkins was ambitious. The Manningtree investigations gave him a taste of power. He saw a path forward, a way to rise above his modest station. He needed a title, something grand, something that commanded respect and instilled fear. So he created one, Witchfinder General. It had an official ring. It suggested authority, sanctioned from on high. But it was a lie, a brilliant, terrifying lie. No parliament appointed him, no king commissioned him. He appointed himself. This self-proclaimed title was audacious. England was in turmoil. The Civil War raged. Central authority was weak. Local officials were often overwhelmed or easily swayed. Hopkins exploited this chaos. He traveled from town to town. He offered his services. He presented his credentials, his self-given title. Many did not question him. They were desperate. They saw witches everywhere. Hopkins was the answer to their prayers, or so they thought. He was a promise of cleansing. He claimed a divine mission. He was doing God's work, rooting out Satan's servants. This religious justification was powerful. It resonated with the Puritan sensibilities of the time. It gave his actions a veneer of righteousness. Who would dare question a man on God's errand? He spoke with conviction. His eyes burned with a cold fire. He convinced people he was an expert, an authority on the unseen world, on the wiles of the devil. He made them believe. The lack of true legal backing did not stop him. He moved quickly. He built a reputation. His methods, though brutal, brought results. Confessions, accusations, executions. For a frightened populace, this was proof. Proof of his skill. Proof of the danger they faced. The title Witchfinder General became a brand, a symbol of his grim trade. He was no general of armies, but he commanded a different kind of force, an army of fear. And he was its undisputed leader. Companions in cruelty, the Witchfinder's troop. Hopkins did not work his dark trade alone. He gathered a small team, individuals who shared his purpose, or perhaps his desire for profit and notoriety. His most prominent associate was John Stern, sometimes called Witch Pricker Stern. He was older than Hopkins, more outwardly zealous, some said. Stern had been involved from the very first accusations in Manning Tree. He became Hopkins's right-hand man, a loyal enforcer of their terrible methods. Together they formed a formidable duo. Another key figure was Mary Phillips, known often as Goody Phillips, or sometimes Goody Rose. Her role was specific and invasive. She was a searcher woman tasked with examining the bodies of accused women. She looked for the devil's mark, teats, where familiars supposedly suckled. These marks could be anything: a mole, a wart, a birthmark, any blemish on the skin. Her discoveries were damning evidence. Her presence added a particular horror for the accused women, subjected to intimate, degrading searches. This team operated like a traveling business, a gruesome enterprise. Hopkins and Stern would arrive in a village, often by invitation, from fearful or opportunistic locals. They would charge a fee for their services, typically around 20 shillings per town, plus expenses. This was a considerable sum. It made witch-finding profitable. For them, it was a living, a way to earn money and status. For the accused, it was a death sentence, paid for by their own communities. Their early successes cemented their reputation. Fear preceded them. As news of their activities spread, so did the terror. Villages that had once known peace were thrown into turmoil. Neighbors suspected neighbors. Old grudges resurfaced as witchcraft accusations. Hopkins and his troop fanned these flames. They were efficient. They were ruthless. They knew how to exploit fear, and they knew how to extract confessions. The Witchfinder General and his companions were becoming experts in their dreadful craft. Their reign of terror was expanding with each passing month. Whispers of the hunt early methods unveiled. The methods of Matthew Hopkins were not born fully formed. They evolved. They were refined. But even in the early days, whispers of his technique spread. Chilling accounts of how he identified witches, how he broke their will. One of his first tools was watching, or waking. The accused would be kept awake for days and nights, bound to a stool in the center of a room, deprived of sleep, deprived of comfort, watched constantly by Hopkins's men or by fearful villagers. This relentless sleep deprivation was a potent weapon. It wore down the body. It confused the mind. After days without rest, hallucinations would begin. The victim, exhausted and disoriented, might say anything to make the torment stop. They might confess to impossible crimes. They might name others as witches just to be allowed to sleep. Hopkins presented these forced utterances as genuine confessions, as proof of guilt. The watchers looked for imps, familiars, small creatures said to be the witch's servants. Any mouse, spider, or fly became suspect. Then there was the search for the devil's mark. This was a central part of his investigation. Hopkins believed every witch had a special mark given by the devil, a place where their familiars suckled blood, or a spot insensitive to pain. His searchers, like Mary Phillips, would examine the accused, often pricking their skin with pins or bodkins. If a spot did not bleed or if the victim did not flinch, it was deemed a devil's mark. But the prickers could be deceitful, using retractable blades or targeting callous skin. The psychological pressure was immense. From the moment of accusation, the victim was isolated, terrified, often already an outcast. Hopkins and Stern were masters of intimidation. They asked leading questions. They twisted words. They created an atmosphere of overwhelming dread. Confession seemed the only escape, though it rarely was. These early methods were just the beginning, a prelude to more systematic cruelty. The fear they generated was palpable. The mere rumor of Hopkins's arrival could send shivers down the spine of an entire community. The hunt was on. The Endless Night. Ordeal by Waking. Matthew Hopkins had a favored method. It was simple. It was brutal. He called it watching, or sometimes waking. The accused, often an old, frail woman, was taken. She was placed in a room, bound tightly to a stool or chair. Her legs were crossed. She was not allowed to move, not allowed to rest, for days and for nights. This was the beginning of her torment, a slow, agonizing descent into madness. The room would be cold or stifling. Comfort was forbidden. Sleep was the enemy. Hopkins believed sleep allowed witches to commune with their familiars, or with the devil himself. So sleep was denied, relentlessly. Watchers, paid by the town or by Hopkins, surrounded the accused. They took turns, ensuring she never closed her eyes. If she nodded, they would shout. They would prod her. They would walk her up and down, until her legs buckled, until her mind frayed. The body craves sleep. The mind needs it. Denied this basic need, the spirit breaks. The effects were devastating. After hours, then days, of forced wakefulness, confusion set in. The world blurred, reality twisted, voices whispered from the shadows. Faces appeared in the flickering candlelight. The accused would become disoriented, exhausted beyond measure. Her will would crumble. She might start to babble, to say anything at all, to make the torment stop, to earn a moment's peace, a moment's precious sleep. Hopkins waited for these moments. He called them confessions. The watching room became a theater of cruelty. The air grew stale with fear and sweat. The silence was broken only by the victim's pleas, or the watcher's harsh commands. Time stretched into an unbearable eternity. Each tick of the clock was a hammer blow. The watchers themselves were often fearful, or eager to prove their zeal. They looked for any sign. A muttered word. A glance towards the door. They were looking for the devil's work. And in the exhausted ramblings of a tormented soul, they often found what Hopkins told them to expect. Section 2. Scars of Satan. The hunt for the witch's mark. Hopkins believed in physical proof. He taught that the devil left his mark upon his servants. A special sign, a seal of their dark covenant. This was the witch's mark, or the devil's mark. It could be a mole, a wart, a birthmark, any unusual blemish on the skin, or it could be an extra teat, a place where imps and familiars suckled. Finding this mark was paramount. It was considered undeniable evidence of witchcraft, a physical manifestation of evil. The search for this mark was a humiliating ordeal, especially for women. Hopkins employed searchers, often women themselves, like Mary Phillips. They would strip the accused naked. Their bodies would be prodded, examined minutely, in public, or before a panel of grim-faced men. Every inch of skin was scrutinized. No privacy was afforded, no dignity was respected. The shame was immense, the fear unbearable. An innocent freckle could become a death sentence. A simple skin tag could seal one's fate. Once a suspicious mark was found, another test followed: the pricking. Hopkins or his assistants used sharp needles, bodkins, or specially designed tools. They would prick the mark. If it did not bleed, or if the accused showed no pain, this was proof. Proof it was a devil's mark. Unnatural, insensitive. But this test was easily manipulated. A blunt pin could be used, or a pin with a retractable point. The pricker could feign surprise at the lack of blood or pain. The victim, already terrified, might be too numb to react. The discovery of a witch's mark was a moment of triumph for Hopkins, and a moment of ultimate despair for the accused. It confirmed their guilt in the eyes of the community. It silenced any remaining doubters. The fear of having such a mark spread rapidly. People examined their own bodies in secret, dreading what they might find. An ordinary blemish became a source of terror. Hopkins' hunt for these marks turned the human body itself into a landscape of potential damnation. He made people fear their own skin. Section 3. Trial by Water. The Cruel Judgment of the Innocent. Another of Hopkins' dreadful tools was the swimming test. This was an ancient ordeal, rooted in superstition. not law. Hopkins revived it with cruel enthusiasm. He argued that water, being a pure element, would reject a witch. It would not accept such an unholy creature into its embrace. Thus, if the accused floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. But this innocence often came at the cost of her life, drowned by the very test meant to exonerate her. A truly diabolical choice. The procedure was a public spectacle and a brutal one. The accused woman, sometimes a man, was bound. Her right thumb tied to her left big toe. Her left thumb to her right big toe. This contorted position made swimming impossible. She was then thrown into a river or a pond. Ropes were usually tied around her waist, so she could be pulled out. Sometimes, if she floated, the crowd jeered. The witchfinder nodded grimly. Proof. If she sank and was pulled out barely alive, she might be declared innocent. But the trauma was immense. This trial by water was deeply terrifying. Imagine the scene. A terrified woman bound and helpless, surrounded by a hostile crowd. The cold water engulfing her, the struggle for breath, the utter certainty of suffering. Whether she floated or sank, pain and terror were guaranteed. Hopkins supervised these events with cold detachment. He saw them as a legitimate means of uncovering guilt. He ignored the fact that a person's buoyancy could be affected by many things. Their clothes, their body fat, not by their allegiance to the devil. The swimming test spread fear far and wide. It was a clear message accusation could lead to this degrading, life-threatening ordeal. There was no dignity in it, no justice, only cruelty disguised as righteousness. The very idea that pure water would reject a witch was a primitive belief. Yet, in the fear-soaked atmosphere of Civil War England, people clung to such notions. Hopkins exploited this. He used the swimming test to bolster his reputation, to provide dramatic proof, and to condemn the innocent to a watery torment. Section 4. Whispers of imps, familiars and forced confessions. Hopkins was obsessed with familiars. These were supposedly small demonic spirits, given to witches by the devil. They often took the form of animals, a cat, a dog, a toad, or even an insect like a fly or spider. Hopkins claimed these imps suckled blood from the witch's mark. They did her evil bidding, causing mischief, sickness, or death. During the long hours of watching, Hopkins and his assistants looked for these familiars. Any creature that entered the room was suspect. A mouse scurrying across the floor, a moth fluttering near the candle. The accused were relentlessly questioned about their familiars. What are their names? Hopkins would demand. What do they look like? What evil have they done for you? Under the duress of sleep deprivation and constant intimidation, victims would sometimes break. They might invent names, describe imaginary creatures, anything to satisfy their tormentors, to stop the endless questions. These pathetic utterances were then recorded as fact, as evidence of their pact with Satan. The pressure to confess to having familiars was immense. Forced confessions were the cornerstone of Hopkins' success. He was a master of psychological manipulation. He knew how to break a person's will. Sleep deprivation was just one tool. He used leading questions, twisting the victim's words. He made threats, subtle or overt. He sometimes offered false hope, hinting that a confession might lead to mercy or a lighter sentence. This was rarely true. A confession, however obtained, was usually a direct path to the gallows or the stake. It was a cruel deception. Once a confession was extracted, it often implicated others. Who else was at the sabbat? Name your fellow witches. Terrified, confused, desperate, the accused might name neighbors, friends, even family members, people they held grudges against, or simply names that came to mind in their delirium. Hopkins eagerly collected these names. Each confession led to new accusations, new investigations. The web of fear spread wider and wider. One forced confession could condemn many innocent souls. It was a chain reaction of terror. Section 5. Words as Weapons. Testimony born of terror. Hopkins did not rely solely on confessions or physical marks. He also gathered testimony, words from others, neighbors, acquaintances, even family members of the accused. He and John Stern actively sought out witnesses. They encouraged people to come forward, to share their suspicions, to recount any strange events, any misfortunes they had suffered, any unusual behavior they had observed. These words became weapons, used to build a case against the accused, to paint a picture of guilt. The testimony gathered was often unreliable. It was frequently based on village gossip, on long-held superstitions, on petty jealousies or old disputes. A cow falling sick, a crop failing, a child becoming ill. These common misfortunes were easily blamed on witchcraft, especially if the accused was an unpopular or eccentric figure. Hopkins listened to these stories intently. He recorded them as evidence. He rarely questioned the motives of the accusers or the truth of their claims. He was not seeking truth. He was seeking convictions. There was immense pressure on people to testify, to condemn the accused. Silence could be seen as sympathy for the witch. It could even lead to suspicion falling on oneself. Fear was a powerful motivator. People testified to protect themselves, to show their loyalty to the community, to prove their piety. Hopkins knew how to exploit these fears. He created an atmosphere where it was dangerous to accuse, where speaking out against a suspected witch was seen as a civic duty, a religious obligation. The impact of this coerced testimony was devastating. Friends turned against friends. Families were torn apart. The fabric of community life was shredded. An innocent person could find themselves condemned by a chorus of voices. Voices driven by fear, by malice, or by a desperate desire to conform. The legal system of the time gave great weight to such witness statements, even if they were contradictory or patently absurd. For Matthew Hopkins, these words were all he needed. They were the nails in the coffin of the accused. As Section 6, the contagion of dread, Hopkins' shadow over England. Matthew Hopkins' methods did more than condemn individuals. They unleashed a contagion of dread. His very presence in a town or village was enough to ignite panic. Rumors of his impending arrival would spread like wildfire. People whispered his name in fear. The Witchfinder General is coming. This announcement alone could shatter the peace of a community. It signaled the start of a terrifying period, a time of suspicion, accusation, and death. His shadow loomed large over East Anglia. The psychological impact was profound. No one felt safe. Everyone was a potential witch or a potential accuser. A harmless old woman who muttered to herself. A person with a birthmark. Someone who kept a pet cat. All could fall under suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust. Children were told to report any strange behavior. The air grew thick with paranoia. Simple kindnesses could be misconstrued. An angry word could become a fatal accusation. Daily life became a minefield of potential dangers. Hopkins understood the power of propaganda. He published a pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches. In it, he defended his methods. He boasted of his successes. This publication helped to legitimize his work in the eyes of some. It spread his reputation further, making him seem like an official authority. Word of mouth also played a crucial role. Tales of his witch findings, often exaggerated, traveled from village to village. These stories amplified the fear and made his gruesome work seem necessary, even heroic to those gripped by witch panic. The damage Hopkins inflicted on the social fabric was immense. Communities that had once been close-knit were torn apart. Trust evaporated, replaced by suspicion and fear. Families were destroyed, livelihoods ruined. The innocent were hanged or burned based on flimsy evidence, coerced confessions, and the pronouncements of a self-proclaimed expert. His reign of terror was a dark chapter, a testament to how fear, superstition, and opportunism can combine to create a living nightmare. The dread he instilled lingered long after he was gone. Section 1. The Chelmsford Assizes. Judgment Day for the accused. The courts of assize convened with solemn dread. Chelmsford in Essex saw many such grim gatherings. Matthew Hopkins had done his work. He had gathered his evidence. He had extracted his confessions. Now the alleged witches faced the magistrates, men of stern countenance, men who often shared the prevailing fears. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and terror. The fate of many souls hung precariously in the balance. The accused women were brought forth, often weak from their ordeals. Some bore the marks of the pricker's needle. Others carried the shame of public searching. They stood alone, facing stern judges and a hostile public gallery. The charges were read out: bewitching cattle, causing fits, murder by sorcery, consorting with familiars. Hopkins himself might be present, or his associate, John Stern. They would present their findings, their testimonies, the forced confessions. Few dared to question the Witchfinder General. His reputation preceded him. The trials were often swift. Defense was almost impossible. For many, the journey to the assizes was merely a formal stop, a brief pause on the inevitable road to the gallows. Elizabeth Clark of Manningtree. Her name echoes as one of the first, one of the earliest victims of Hopkins's crusade. She was an old woman, poor, one-legged, an easy target for the fear that festered in the village. Whispers turned to accusations. Accusations brought Matthew Hopkins to her door. He began his investigation. He subjected her to the torment of watching. For days and nights she was kept from sleep, watched, questioned. Her frail body and weary mind pushed beyond their limits. Under this immense pressure, Elizabeth began to speak. She confessed to having familiars, imps given to her by the devil. She named them: Holt, a white kitten; Jarmara, a fat spaniel without legs; Saki and Sugar, a black rabbit; and News, a polecat. Most infamous was Vinegar Tom, a long-legged greyhound with a head like an ox. These fantastical creatures, born of exhaustion and suggestion, became proof of her guilt. Hopkins meticulously recorded her words. Her confession, wrung from her through suffering, was a triumph for him. The trial itself was a formality. Elizabeth Clark, broken and confused, could offer little resistance. Elizabeth Clark was condemned to die. The case of Ann West and her daughter Rebecca is a heartbreaking tale. It shows the depths of cruelty in Hopkins' methods. Ann West, an elderly woman from Lawford, Essex, was accused. Like so many others, she was subjected to the usual torments: the watching, the pricking, the relentless interrogation. But Hopkins sought more than just her confession. He sought to use her own family against her, to create a web of accusation that was impossible to escape. Her daughter, Rebecca West, was also arrested, likely under immense pressure, terrified for her own life. Perhaps Hopkins offered her a terrible choice: confess and implicate your mother, or face the full force of the accusations yourself. Rebecca, young and frightened, eventually broke. She confessed to witchcraft, and she testified against her own mother, Anne. Ann West's trial was a tragic spectacle. Her own daughter's testimony was a key piece of evidence. It sealed her fate. She was sentenced to hang. The story of Anne and Rebecca West illustrates the insidious nature of the witch hunts. When the trials concluded and guilt was pronounced, the final act began: the execution. In England, for witchcraft, this usually meant hanging. The condemned were taken to a public place, often a hill outside the town, known as the Gallows Hill. It was a spectacle, a grim form of entertainment for some, a terrifying warning for all. Crowds would gather, men, women, and children, to witness the law taking its course, to see the supposed servants of Satan meet their end. The atmosphere was charged with a morbid energy. The journey to the gallows was an ordeal in itself. The condemned, often weak and battered, were paraded through the streets, subjected to the jeers and curses of the crowd, or sometimes to a chilling silence. They might be allowed a final prayer, a chance to speak. Some maintained their innocence to the very end. Others, broken and defeated, went silently. Some might even curse their accusers, or the Witchfinder himself. Their last words were often recorded, twisted, or used as further proof of their evil nature. The act of hanging was brutal. The noose placed around the neck. The cart pulled away. The summer of 1645 saw one of the largest mass witch trials in English history. At Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk, Matthew Hopkins and John Stern were central figures. They had swept through Suffolk, gathering accusations, applying their dreadful methods. The local jails were soon overflowing with suspected witches, men and women, young and old. The scale of the arrests was unprecedented. Fear and hysteria gripped the region. It seemed the devil's legions were truly being rooted out, or so many believed. The trials at Bury St. Edmunds were a grim affair. Dozens faced the judges. Sir Matthew Hale, a notable jurist, presided over some. The evidence presented was typical Hopkins fare. Confessions extracted under duress. Stories of familiars. Testimony about unexplained illnesses and misfortunes. The sheer number of accused created an overwhelming momentum. It was hard for justice to prevail amid such widespread panic. Each conviction seemed to confirm the reality of the witch craze. Each guilty verdict fueled further accusations and fear. As many as 18 people were hanged on a single day. In August 1645. A staggering number. Imagine the scene. The procession to the gallows. Though hanging was the legal punishment for witchcraft in England, the image of burning at the stake cast a long, terrifying shadow. This was the fate of heretics. This was the method used with horrifying frequency in witch trials across continental Europe. The English knew of these burnings. They read about them in pamphlets. They heard tales from travelers. The thought of such an agonizing death was a potent source of terror. It represented the ultimate punishment, a foretaste of hellfire itself, a visceral horror beyond comprehension. Matthew Hopkins, though his victims typically went to the gallows, masterfully played on this deeper, more primal fear. The very idea of witchcraft was tied to Satan, to eternal damnation. Burning alive seemed a fitting end for those who had supposedly sold their souls. The dread of the stake amplified the terror of any accusation. It made the prospect of being named a witch even more horrifying. It was the unspoken threat, the ultimate nightmare. Imagine the scene described in hushed, fearful whispers. The condemned dragged to a public square, bound tightly to a thick wooden post. Bundles of dry wood, faggots piled high around their feet. The priest's final, futile exhortations. The executioner with his torch. The arrival of Matthew Hopkins was like a sickness. It infected the very soul of a community. Trust, once the bedrock of village life, crumbled into dust. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Friend suspected friend. The familiar bonds of fellowship were replaced by a chilling unease. Every glance held potential menace. Every whispered word could be a death sentence. Hopkins did not just find witches. He sowed discord. He cultivated an atmosphere where the poison of suspicion could thrive, choking the life from once tight-knit hamlets and towns. His shadow fell, and with it, a darkness in human hearts. Old friendships, forged over years of shared joys and sorrows, shattered under the strain. A kind gesture could be twisted, a harmless comment misconstrued as evidence of dark allegiance. People who had broken bread together now eyed each other with wary apprehension. The local alehouse, once a place of boisterous camaraderie, became a den of hushed tones and furtive looks. Who among them was a servant of the devil? Who would be next to point an accusing finger? The air itself felt thick with silent accusations. The social fabric, once strong, unraveled thread by thread, leaving gaping holes of fear. Section 2. A Harvest of Fear. Daily life under the Witchfinder's shadow. Life under the shadow of the Witchfinder. General was a constant thrum of anxiety. Fear became a daily companion. It sat with families at their meager meals. It lurked in the dark corners of their homes. It followed them to the fields and to the market. Every unexplained event, every sudden illness, every piece of bad luck was viewed through a prism of terror. Was it witchcraft? Was a neighbor harboring evil intent? The ordinary rhythms of life were disrupted by this pervasive dread. Sleep offered little respite, often filled with nightmares of accusations and familiars. The world felt unsafe, unpredictable. People changed their behavior. They became more guarded, more withdrawn. Laughter became muted. Expressions of joy were tempered by caution. To appear too happy might attract unwanted attention. To be too different, too outspoken, or too solitary was to invite suspicion. Many tried to make themselves invisible, to blend into the background. They avoided conflict. They spoke carefully. They attended church services with fervent, perhaps feigned, piety. Anything to avoid the dreaded pointing finger. The Witchfinder's presence, even the rumor of it, was enough to stifle the spirit of a whole community. Children were not immune to this reign of terror. They absorbed the fear from the adults around them. Their games became less joyful. Their imaginations, already vivid, were fueled by terrifying tales of witches and demons. Parents warned their children to be wary, not to speak to strangers, to report anything unusual they saw or heard. Some children, caught up in the hysteria, even became accusers themselves, repeating overheard gossip, or inventing stories under pressure. The innocence of childhood was another casualty of Hopkins' crusade. Their young minds were scarred by the horrors they witnessed or were told about. The very landscape seemed altered by the fear. A gnarled tree might be seen as a meeting place for witches. A black cat once a harmless pet, could become a suspected familiar. The forests and lonely paths, once places of quiet solitude, now seemed menacing, full of unseen dangers. Every shadow seemed to dance with malevolent intent. The natural world, once a source of sustenance and wonder, became imbued with supernatural threat. Hopkins had not just targeted individuals. He had transformed the way people perceived their entire world. He reaped a bitter harvest of unrelenting fear. Section 3. The Scars of Accusation. Families ripped asunder. The witch hunts did not just break communities. They tore families apart with brutal efficiency. An accusation could fall upon a mother, a father, a spouse, or a child. The bonds of love and loyalty were tested in the cruelest ways imaginable. Imagine the agony of watching a loved one dragged away, subjected to torture and humiliation, knowing that your own words or your silence could seal their fate. The family unit, the very heart of society, was often the first casualty when the Witchfinder came to town. The hearth, once a symbol of warmth and safety, became a place of unbearable tension and sorrow. When a family member was accused, their remaining relatives faced an impossible dilemma. To defend the accused was to risk being implicated themselves. It was to invite the suspicion of being a witch's accomplice or sympathizer. Yet, to remain silent, or worse, to join in the condemnation, was a betrayal that would haunt them forever. Some, out of terror for their own lives or the lives of their other children, succumbed to the pressure. They might offer testimony against their own kin. Driven by fear, they became instruments of Hopkins' cruel machine. The emotional scars of such betrayals ran deep. The case of Rebecca West, forced to testify against her mother Anne, was not unique. Children, terrified and suggestible, were sometimes manipulated into accusing their parents. Husbands turned on wives, wives on husbands, siblings against siblings. The intense psychological pressure exerted by Hopkins and the atmosphere of mass hysteria could shatter even the strongest familial ties. Love, duty, and kinship were sacrificed on the altar of fear. The Witchfinder's methods exploited the deepest human vulnerabilities, turning affection into a weapon of destruction. The devastation was absolute. The aftermath of such familial destruction was bleak. Children were left orphaned, spouses widowed, homes were broken. The shame and stigma of having a witch in the family could cling for generations. Survivors often faced social ostracism and economic hardship. The cohesive structure of family life, so vital for support and continuity, was shattered into a million pieces. Hopkins' pursuit of witches left a trail of broken hearts and ruined families, a testament to the devastating power of fear to unravel the most sacred human connections. The familial wounds were often the deepest and slowest to heal. Section 4. Economic ruin and social decay, the wider cost. Matthew Hopkins' witch hunting was a costly business. Not for him, perhaps, but certainly for the towns and villages that employed his services. He and his assistants charged substantial fees. 20 shillings per town was a common rate, plus their living expenses. This was a significant sum for small, often struggling communities, especially during the economic hardships of the Civil War. This money, desperately needed for local relief or infrastructure, was instead funneled into the pockets of the men who brought terror and death. The financial burden was a heavy one. Beyond Hopkins' direct fees, there were other costs. The imprisonment of suspected witches cost money. Feeding them, guarding them, even if they were treated abysmally, incurred expenses. Then there were the costs of the trials themselves and the executions. The hangman had to be paid. The wood for the gallows had to be sourced. These grim expenditures drained local coffers. Resources that could have been used to alleviate poverty, repair war damage, or support the vulnerable were instead consumed by the machinery of the witch hunt. The pursuit of phantom evils had a very real, very tangible economic price. The witch hunts also had a damaging impact on local economies in less direct ways. When fear and suspicion ran rampant, productivity suffered. Fields might be neglected as people were too scared or too preoccupied with accusations to work. Trade could be disrupted as outsiders became wary of entering a town known for its witch trials. Some people might even flee their homes, abandoning their livelihoods to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The loss of individuals, whether through execution, imprisonment, or flight, meant a loss of labor and skills vital to the community's well-being. The economy itself sickened. This economic strain contributed to a broader social decay. As communities became poorer and more fractured, social order began to fray. The focus on witchcraft diverted attention from other pressing social problems. The constant fear and turmoil were not conducive to a healthy, functioning society. Hopkins's activities, far from purifying the land, often left it more impoverished, more divided, and more unstable. The pursuit of witches was not just a moral catastrophe. It was an economic and social drain that exacerbated the suffering of an already war-torn nation. The cost was far greater than just the lives lost. In the face of such widespread terror and injustice, a troubling question arises. Why did so few people speak out against Matthew Hopkins and his methods? The answer lies largely in the suffocating power of fear. To question the Witchfinder General, to doubt his pronouncements, or to defend an accused witch was an incredibly dangerous act. It could easily lead to the questioner themselves being branded a witch's sympathizer, or worse, a witch, in an atmosphere where mere suspicion could lead to the gallows. Silence often seemed the only safe option. Self-preservation triumphed over moral courage. Hopkins, despite his self-appointed title, wielded considerable perceived authority. He was often invited by local magistrates, men of standing in their communities. These officials, themselves swayed by fear or a desire to appear tough on crime and deviancy, gave Hopkins a veneer of legitimacy. His confident demeanor, his supposed expertise, and his pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, all contributed to this image. Challenging him meant challenging the local authorities and the prevailing consensus. Few had the standing or the courage to take such a risk. His power seemed unassailable. Religious fervor also played a significant role in suppressing dissent. The witch hunts were framed as a holy war against Satan. Hopkins presented himself as God's instrument, cleansing the land of evil. In a deeply religious society, particularly one with strong Puritan influences, this was a powerful argument. To oppose the witch hunts could be interpreted as opposing God's will, as siding with the devil. Such a stance was unthinkable for most. The fear of eternal damnation was as potent, if not more so, than the fear of temporal punishment. Piety demanded conformity. Yet the silence was not absolute. Whispers of unease did begin to surface. Some clergymen, like John Gall of Great Staughton, eventually challenged Hopkins directly, questioning his methods and his motives. These were brave acts. But for a long time, such voices were few and far between. The overwhelming tide of fear, authority, and religious conviction drowned them out. For most, it was easier and safer to believe, or at least to pretend to believe. The terror Hopkins instilled ensured that the voices of reason and compassion were, for a tragically long period, effectively silenced. The stage was set for his continued reign. The cracks appear, seeds of doubt and opposition. Matthew Hopkins had carved a fearsome reputation. His methods brought swift, brutal results. Many saw him as a savior, a purifier of a land besieged by Satan. He moved with grim purpose. From Essex to Suffolk, Norfolk to Cambridgeshire, leaving a trail of fear and death. But such widespread terror could not last forever. The sheer number of accusations began to trouble some. The endless parade to the gallows. Could so many truly be witches? Whispers of doubt started to circulate, quiet at first, then growing. His success made him bold. Perhaps too bold. He seemed untouchable, a man on a divine mission. Yet his authority was self-proclaimed. He held no official parliamentary commission. This fact began to surface more widely. Some local officials grew wary. The cost of his services was high. Towns paid dearly for his expertise, not just in shillings and pence, but in the lives of their people. The social fabric was tearing. Communities, once places of trust, were now riddled with suspicion. The price of cleansing was becoming too steep for some to bear. Figures of conscience began to emerge. Men who dared to question the Witchfinder. They saw the injustice, the cruelty, the manipulation. They noted the flimsy evidence, the forced confessions, the terror in the eyes of the accused. These were not the actions of righteous justice. They were the hallmarks of tyranny, of opportunism preying on fear. These brave individuals started to voice their concerns, cautiously at first, then with growing conviction. They knew the risks, but silence was no longer an option. A countercurrent was forming. Hopkins, for his part, was not easily deterred. He defended his actions vigorously. He believed in his work, or he believed in the power it gave him. He dismissed his critics. He labeled them as sympathizers with witches, or as ignorant fools. He even published his pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, in 1647, to justify his methods, to bolster his authority. But the tide was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to turn. The cracks in his fearsome edifice were starting to show. His reign of terror was not unshakable. The Witchfinder questioned Gall's courageous stand. Among the voices raised against Hopkins, one stands out. John Gall, the Puritan rector of Great Staughton in Huntingdonshire. He was a man of God, like Hopkins claimed to be. But Gall saw something ungodly in the Witchfinder's work. He witnessed Hopkins' methods firsthand. He saw the fear, he saw the injustice, and he decided to act. He would not stand by silently while his parishioners were terrorized. He would challenge the Witchfinder General directly. A dangerous, courageous undertaking in such fraught times. Gall began to preach against Hopkins from his own pulpit. He questioned the legitimacy of Hopkins' self-given title. He attacked the cruelty and unreliability of his methods. Sleep deprivation, the pricking for marks, the infamous swimming test. Gall argued these were not lawful, not scriptural. He wrote a book, Select Cases of Conscience Towards Witches and Witchcraft, published in 1646. In it, he exposed the fallacies of Hopkins' techniques. He warned people against such brutal and superstitious practices. He provided an intellectual counter-argument. His opposition was not merely academic. Gall actively worked to prevent Hopkins from operating in his area. He rallied local opinion. He spoke to magistrates. He made it clear that the Witchfinder was not welcome. This was a direct challenge, a public defiance of the man who held so many in his thrall. Gall's actions provided a focal point for others who harbored doubts, for those too afraid to speak out alone. He showed that Hopkins was not invincible, that his authority could be questioned, that resistance was possible. The impact of Gall's stand was significant. It marked a turning point. Hopkins, used to adulation or fearful silence, faced organized, reasoned opposition. He even visited Gall, attempting to intimidate him or to reason with him. But Gall stood firm. His courage inspired others. Magistrates grew more skeptical. Communities became less willing to pay Hopkins fees. The momentum of the witch hunts, at least in areas influenced by Gall and others like him, began to slow. The Witchfinder's spell was beginning to break. The tide was perceptibly shifting against him. The end of a dark reign. Hopkins' final days. The opposition, led by men like John Gall, had an effect. The invitations for Matthew Hopkins to visit towns dwindled. His income declined. His reputation, once fearsome, now carried a taint of controversy. The parliamentarian newspaper, the moderate intelligencer, even published criticisms of his activities. The landscape was changing. The intense heat of the witch panic, fanned so expertly by Hopkins, was beginning to cool. His services were no longer in such high demand. His days as the undisputed Witchfinder General were numbered. The ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Legends surround Matthew Hopkins' own end. One persistent tale claims he was himself accused of witchcraft, that he was subjected to his own swimming test, and that he floated, thus proving his guilt. This story, while dramatically fitting, is likely apocryphal. There is no firm historical evidence to support it. It seems more a product of folklore, a desire for poetic justice, a wish that the tormentor should suffer as his victims had. Such tales reflect the deep hatred and fear he had instilled, a legend born from collective trauma. The reality of Hopkins' demise was more mundane, though no less final. He died in Manningtree, Essex, in August 1647. Not at the gallows, not by drowning, but in his bed. Most likely from tuberculosis, a common killer of the age. He was still a young man, probably not yet 30. His reign of terror had been relatively short, lasting only about 3 years, from 1644 to 1647. Yet in that brief span, he had left an indelible scar on the face of England. His death was quiet, unremarkable, unlike the public spectacles of death he had orchestrated for so many others. With Hopkins gone, the intensity of the witch hunts in East Anglia significantly decreased. The panic he had fueled began to subside. John Stern attempted to continue the work for a short time, but he lacked Hopkins' charisma, his organizational skill, his terrifying aura. The era of the self-proclaimed Witchfinder General was over. Witch trials did not cease entirely in England, but the specific, concentrated wave of terror unleashed by Hopkins had broken. The shadow began to lift, albeit slowly. The nightmare, for many, was finally drawing to a close. A legacy, etched in fear, the Witchfinder's enduring shadow. Matthew Hopkins died, but his name lived on, etched in the annals of English history, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a figure of infamy, a symbol of cruelty, fanaticism, and the terrifying power of mass hysteria. He became the Witchfinder General, not by official decree, but by the sheer force of his will and the fear he so expertly manipulated. His legacy is a dark one, a chilling reminder of a time when superstition reigned and justice was a fragile, often shattered thing. His shadow stretches long across the centuries. His brief, brutal career had a profound impact. Hundreds were accused, many were executed based on his discoveries and his methods. He did not invent witch hunting, but he systematized it. He professionalized it in a horrifying way. He turned it into a grim trade, The scale of his operations in East Anglia was unprecedented in England. He left behind a landscape scarred by fear, communities broken by suspicion, families devastated by loss. His actions became a benchmark for the horrors of the witch craze, a dark chapter in the nation's story. The figure of Matthew Hopkins has haunted popular culture ever since. He has appeared in books, in films, in plays, often portrayed as the ultimate villain, a cold, calculating manipulator, a sadist driven by power or greed. The 1968 film, Witchfinder General, cemented this image, presenting him as a truly demonic character. This enduring fascination speaks to the deep horror his story evokes. He has become an archetype, the witch hunter incarnate, a boogeyman from a darker age, a warning from history's depths. The terrifying tale of Matthew Hopkins serves as a stark lesson. It teaches us about the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of reason in the face of fear, the ease with which societies can be driven to persecute the innocent, the vulnerable, the different. His story is a testament to the darkness that can lurk within human hearts and the courage it takes to stand against it. The fear he instilled was real. The suffering he caused was immense. His legacy is a solemn warning, lest we forget the horrors that can be unleashed when fear and those who exploit it are allowed to reign.